The early morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when the owner of Sky Elite Airways arrived at Riverside Regional Airport. The crisp autumn air nipped at his face as he walked across the tarmac, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete. His pilot's uniform was perfectly pressed, each golden stripe on his shoulder catching the dawn light, a reminder of his 15 years of flying experience. Today was special. The newest addition to his charter fleet had arrived last week, and he wanted to personally ensure everything was perfect before its first commercial flight. As the founder of the company, he believed in hands-on leadership. That meant being the first one at the airport, checking every detail himself. He pulled out his checklist and began his methodical inspection of the sleek aircraft. His hands glided over the smooth surface of the fuselage as he checked for any irregularities. The pre-flight routine was something he had done thousands of times, but he never rushed it. Each step was crucial, from examining the wing flaps to checking the landing gear. Several ground crew members waved good morning as they passed by. Most of them had worked with him for years, watching his company grow from a single small plane to a respected charter service. He waved back, taking pride in how his dream had become a successful reality. As he walked around the tail section, he remembered his journey. Starting as a young aviation enthusiast, working extra jobs to pay for flight school, serving in the Air Force, and finally saving enough to start his own company. Every early morning inspection reminded him of how far he'd come. He paused to make notes on his tablet, documenting every detail of the inspection. The sun was higher now, casting long shadows across the runway. In the distance, he could hear the rumble of other aircraft preparing for their morning departures. This was his favorite time at the airport. Peaceful, purposeful, full of possibility. Opening the aircraft door, he climbed aboard to begin the interior inspection. The new leather seats still had that fresh smell, and the cockpit's instruments gleamed. He settled into the pilot's seat, running his hands over the controls he knew so well. This was more than just a pre-flight check. It was a moment of quiet pride in what he had built. Just then, he noticed movement outside the plane. Through the cockpit window, he saw an unfamiliar security officer approaching with quick, determined steps. The officer's body language seemed tense, suspicious. Little did he know that this routine morning was about to become anything but ordinary. He gathered his documentation, knowing from experience that new security personnel sometimes needed extra verification. As he prepared to step out of the aircraft, he took a deep breath, maintaining the professional demeanor that had carried him through countless similar situations in his career. The next few moments would test not just his patience, but the progress of an entire industry. The new security officer had only been working at Riverside Regional Airport for 3 weeks. Fresh from training and eager to prove himself, he took pride in spotting anything out of the ordinary. This morning, something caught his eye that didn't fit his expectations. A black man in a pilot's uniform examining an expensive private aircraft. The officer stood near the terminal building, watching intently. In all his training materials and security briefings, he'd never seen many pilots who looked like the man conducting the inspection. His mind started racing with assumptions, despite the professional appearance and confident movements of the person he was observing. Coffee in hand, he nudged his colleague. "Hey, you ever seen that guy before?" he asked, pointing toward the aircraft. His colleague was busy checking manifests and barely looked up. "New guy on the security team, huh?" she replied with a knowing smile, but the officer had already started walking toward the plane. His radio crackled at his hip as he moved across the tarmac. The morning sun cast long shadows, and the sound of distant jet engines provided a constant background hum. Other airport workers went about their business, ground crew directing smaller aircraft, maintenance teams doing their rounds, flight crews arriving for their shifts. The security officer's training had taught him to look for suspicious behavior, but what he saw as suspicious was really just thorough professionalism. The pilot's methodical inspection, the careful noting of details, the close examination of various parts of the aircraft. all standard procedure that the officer misinterpreted through the lens of his preconceptions. As he got closer, he noticed the pilot's uniform was immaculate, with captain's stripes clearly visible. The aircraft itself was a new model, its paint gleaming in the morning light. Everything about the scene spoke of legitimacy and professionalism, yet something in the officer's mind refused to accept what he was seeing. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his radio as he approached. The pilot was now in the cockpit, going through what appeared to be a pre-flight checklist. The officer's steps became more determined, his posture stiffening as he prepared for what he believed would be a security intervention. Other airport staff members noticed his approach and exchanged glances. A few shook their heads, recognizing what was about to unfold. One veteran ground crew member even started walking in the same direction, knowing from years of experience that sometimes new security officers needed guidance in avoiding embarrassing situations. The morning breeze carried the sounds of more arriving flights, and the airport was coming to life with increasing activity. But right here, in this moment, time seemed to slow down as the officer reached the aircraft's stairs. He cleared his throat, ready to confront someone who was simply doing their job, someone who owned not just this plane, but the entire charter company. Looking up at the cockpit, the officer's voice carried more authority than experience as he prepared to make what would soon prove to be a serious error in judgment. The next few moments would highlight not just his misconceptions, but a larger issue that still persisted in the aviation industry and beyond. "Excuse me, sir. Step away from the aircraft immediately." The security officer's voice boomed across the tarmac, drawing attention from nearby ground crew. The pilot looked up from his checklist, maintaining his composure despite the aggressive tone. He'd faced similar situations before, though he'd hoped times were changing. "Good morning, officer," the pilot responded calmly, reaching for his credentials. "I'm just completing my pre-flight checks." His voice carried years of experience and authority, yet remained professional and measured. He began descending the aircraft stairs, ID badge and pilot's license already in hand. The security officer's stance remained rigid, his hand still resting near his radio. "I need to see some identification and proof you're authorized to be near this aircraft." The demand came out sharp, despite the pilot already holding out his documentation. Around them, the morning airport bustle continued, but several workers had slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold. "Of course," the pilot replied, extending his credentials. "As you can see, I'm the chief pilot and owner of Sky Elite Airways. This is our newest aircraft, and I'm conducting standard pre-flight inspections." He spoke clearly and professionally, having learned that staying calm in these situations was crucial. The security officer took the documents, but his skepticism was visible on his face. He turned the pilot's license over in his hands repeatedly, as if expecting to find evidence of forgery. "Owner?" "Of the whole company." The disbelief in his voice was unmistakable, making several onlookers shake their heads in disappointment. "Yes, I founded the company 5 years ago," the pilot explained patiently. "We operate 3 aircraft now, with this being our newest addition. Feel free to verify with airport management." He gestured toward the terminal building, where he'd spent countless hours negotiating contracts and building relationships. The security officer's radio crackled to life with routine airport communications, but he remained focused on the documents in his hands. "This seems unusual," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I'll need to verify this with my supervisor and the aircraft's actual owner." A slight smile crossed the pilot's face, not one of amusement, but of familiar resignation. "Officer, as I've explained, I am the owner. Every document you're holding confirms this. Would you like to see the aircraft's registration and purchase papers as well?" By now, several of the pilot's employees had noticed the confrontation. 2 maintenance crew members began walking over, their faces showing concern and frustration at seeing their boss subjected to this treatment. The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the tarmac as this scene continued to play out. "Stay back," please." The officer called to the approaching maintenance crew, his voice betraying growing uncertainty. He keyed his radio, speaking quickly. "Security dispatch, I need backup at Hangar 6. Possible unauthorized access to private aircraft." The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. The pilot took a deep breath, straightening his already perfect uniform. Years of breaking barriers in aviation had taught him that these moments, though difficult, were opportunities for change. He watched as the security officer called for police assistance, knowing that the truth would soon become clear, though at the cost of dignity and time. Around them, the airport continued its morning rhythm of departures and arrivals, but this small drama was about to become a powerful reminder that assumptions and biases had no place in professional settings. The next few minutes would test everyone involved, leading to consequences that would ripple through the entire airport community. The next few minutes felt like hours as more security officers gathered around the aircraft. The morning had turned from routine to tense, with the pilot standing calmly beside his plane while airport employees watched in disbelief. The security officer who started it all kept glancing between his radio and the credentials in his hand, waiting for backup that he'd unnecessarily called. "Sir, you'll need to step away from the aircraft until we can verify your story," another security officer announced, joining his colleague. The pilot noticed this one was older, with gray hair showing beneath his cap, but still following his junior colleague's lead despite the obvious discomfort on his face. From the terminal building, two of the pilot's office staff hurried toward the scene. One carried a folder full of documents, aircraft registrations, company paperwork, and ownership records. They'd seen similar situations before and knew exactly what might help resolve this unnecessary confrontation. "This is ridiculous," one of the ground crew members muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "That's the owner of Sky Elite Airways. He's here every morning, checking his aircraft like any responsible pilot would." The small crowd of airport workers nodded in agreement, their frustration visible. The first security officer's radio crackled again. "Police units are 3 minutes out." The announcement made several people shake their heads in disappointment. The pilot remained steady, his expression professional but tired, the kind of tiredness that comes from facing these situations too many times before. "Officer," the pilot spoke up, his voice clear and controlled. "While we wait for the police, I'd like you to think about something. What exactly made you suspicious of a uniformed pilot conducting standard pre-flight checks?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The younger security officer shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. The growing crowd of airport workers had created an unexpected audience for his mistake. Some were taking out their phones, sensing that this incident needed to be documented. One of the office staff reached the group, slightly out of breath. "I have all the company documentation right here," she announced, holding up the folder, "including the recent purchase papers for this aircraft and proof of ownership." Her voice carried a mix of concern and determination. The older security officer reached for the documents, but his younger colleague blocked him. "We need to wait for the police now," he insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier confidence. The morning sun now hit the aircraft's windows, creating a glare that made everyone squint. In the distance, police sirens became audible. The pilot checked his watch. His carefully planned morning schedule was now completely disrupted. Yet he stayed calm, knowing that his response to this situation could help prevent similar incidents in the future. "You know what the saddest part is?" A veteran mechanic spoke up from the crowd. "He built this company from nothing, created jobs for dozens of us, and still has to prove he belongs here." The words caused several heads to nod in agreement, while the security officers looked increasingly uncomfortable. As the police cars pulled up to the hangar, their lights flashing in the morning sun, the pilot straightened his uniform one more time. Years of experience had taught him that the next few moments would be crucial, not just for resolving this situation, but for setting an example of how to handle discrimination with dignity and strength. Two police officers stepped out of their patrol cars, taking in the scene before them. The morning sun now fully illuminated the gathering of airport workers, security officers, and the well-dressed pilot standing calmly beside his aircraft. The crowd parted as the officers approached, their boots clicking against the tarmac. "What seems to be the problem here?" asked the first officer, an experienced-looking woman with short gray hair and watchful eyes. She glanced between the security officer and the pilot, quickly assessing the situation. Her partner, a younger officer, began taking notes on a small pad. "We have a situation with unauthorized access to this aircraft," the security officer started, but multiple voices from the crowd immediately protested. The pilot raised his hand slightly, and everyone fell quiet, a small gesture that showed just how much respect he had earned from his employees. "Officers," the pilot spoke clearly, "I'm the owner of Sky Elite Airways. I was conducting my regular pre-flight inspection when the security team decided I looked suspicious." His tone remained professional, but the implications were clear. The female officer's expression shifted slightly as understanding dawned. The younger police officer looked at the documentation being held by both the security team and the office staff. "May I see all the paperwork, please?" he asked politely. The contrast between his professional approach and the security officer's earlier aggression was striking. As the officers reviewed the documents, more airport staff had gathered. The morning flights continued overhead, but here on the ground, time seemed to stand still. The security officer who had started it all kept looking at his shoes, the realization of his mistake becoming increasingly apparent. "Sir," the female officer addressed the pilot, "your credentials are perfectly in order. You're not just authorized to be here, you own the place." She turned to the security team, her expression stern. "Would you mind explaining why you felt it necessary to call us out here?" The younger security officer struggled to find words. It seemed unusual. I mean, I've never seen." He stopped, perhaps finally hearing how his own words sounded. The older security officer beside him closed his eyes briefly, embarrassment clear on his face. The pilot stepped forward. "Officers, if I may." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "This is an opportunity. Every time something like this happens, we have a choice. We can let it divide us, or we can use it to learn and do better." His words carried the weight of experience, of someone who had turned similar moments into stepping stones for progress. Several phones in the crowd were recording now, capturing what had turned from a confrontation into a teaching moment. The morning heat was building, but nobody moved to leave. They all sensed the importance of what was unfolding. The female officer nodded, understanding written on her face. "You're absolutely right, sir. And I believe some additional training might be in order here." She glanced meaningfully at the security team. The younger officer was now visibly sweating, and not just from the sun. Airport management representatives were hurrying across the tarmac now, having finally been alerted to the situation. The pilot checked his watch again. The morning's inspection routine was completely derailed, but perhaps something more valuable was being accomplished here. The crowd watched as the truth of the situation settled over everyone present. This wasn't just about one morning or one mistake. It was about recognizing and addressing the subtle biases that could turn routine moments into unnecessary confrontations. The pilot's dignified handling of the situation would become a powerful example for the entire airport community. The airport's operations manager arrived at the scene, slightly out of breath from rushing across the tarmac. His eyes widened as he recognized the pilot, someone he'd had countless meetings with, signed numerous contracts with, and considered a valuable partner in the airport's growth. "What in the world is going on here?" he asked, looking around at the gathered crowd. "Why are there police officers surrounding one of our most respected business owners?" His voice carried both authority and genuine confusion. The young security officer seemed to shrink even further into himself. The female police officer stepped forward, explaining the situation in low tones to the operations manager. His face shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to something between embarrassment and anger. He turned to face the pilot, who still maintained his professional demeanor despite everything. "I can't begin to apologize enough," the operations manager started, but the pilot raised his hand gently to pause him. The morning sun was now high enough to cast their shadows directly beneath them, marking how much time had been wasted on this unnecessary confrontation. "Before we discuss apologies," the pilot said, his voice carrying across the now quiet gathering, "I'd like to share something with everyone here." He turned to face the young security officer, who finally looked up to meet his eyes. 10 years ago, I was told I didn't look like a pilot. 5 years ago, I was told I didn't look like a business owner. Today, I own a successful charter company with 3 aircraft and 30 employees." The crowd listened intently, phone still recording, as he continued. "Every time someone doubted me because of how I looked, I had 2 choices. Let it defeat me, or let it fuel me. I chose the second option every time." His words resonated across the tarmac, carrying weight beyond just this morning's incident. The operations manager nodded slowly, understanding that this moment could transform the airport's culture. The police officers exchanged glances, recognizing they were witnessing something important. Even the young security officer's expression had changed from embarrassment to thoughtful attention. "What we do next matters more than what just happened," the pilot continued. "Instead of punishment, I suggest education. Instead of shame, let's choose growth." He pulled out his business card and handed it to the young security officer. "Next week, I'm hosting a workshop about aviation careers for local high school students. I'd like you to come and help me show them that appearances don't define capabilities." The security officer took the card with slightly trembling hands, stunned by this unexpected turn. Around them, airport staff began nodding in approval. The female police officer smiled, tucking her notebook away. This situation had resolved itself in the best possible way. The operations manager stepped forward again. "I think we can all learn from this example of leadership," he announced. "And I believe we need to review and update our security training immediately." His words carried both authority and commitment to change. The morning's tension began to dissolve, replaced by a sense of possibility. What had started as a confrontation had transformed into an opportunity for growth. The pilot's response had turned a potentially volatile situation into a moment of education and understanding. As the crowd began to disperse, returning to their regular duties, many stopped to shake the pilot's hand or pat him on the back. His dignified handling of the situation had earned him even more respect than his business success. The incident would be remembered not for its initial conflict, but for how it ended, with wisdom, grace, and a path forward. As the crowd dispersed and the police officers prepared to leave, the pilot finally returned to his aircraft to resume his inspection. But something had changed in the air around him. Every person who walked past now saw him differently, not just as a successful business owner, but as someone who turned conflict into connection. The young security officer lingered behind, gathering courage to speak. His supervisor had told him to return to his post, but something kept him rooted to the spot. Finally, he approached the pilot, who was checking the aircraft's wings. "Sir," he started, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to say something." The pilot turned, giving him his full attention. The morning sun highlighted the security officer's young face, showing every trace of regret and understanding dawning in his expression. "I've been doing this job for 3 weeks," the officer continued. "They taught us to look for anything unusual, but nobody taught us to look at our own assumptions. I'm not just sorry. I'm embarrassed that I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment." The pilot paused his inspection, recognizing the sincerity in the young man's voice. Around them, the airport had returned to its normal rhythm. Planes taking off, ground crews moving equipment, the constant hum of aviation in motion. But this moment felt separate from all that noise. "When I was your age," the pilot responded, "someone told me I didn't belong in aviation. Instead of getting angry, I got my pilot's license. When banks wouldn't loan me money for my first plane, I worked 2 jobs until I could buy it myself. Every obstacle became a stepping stone. He reached into the aircraft and pulled out a worn logbook. See this. It's my first flight log. I keep it to remind me of where I started. He opened it carefully, showing pages filled with early flight hours, training notes, and the gradual building of a dream into reality. The security officer looked at the logbook with newfound respect. Other airport staff passing by slowed down, catching snippets of the conversation. What they witnessed wasn't a lecture or a scolding, but a moment of genuine human connection and understanding. You know what's interesting? The pilot continued, closing the logbook. The same determination that helped me overcome barriers in aviation also taught me how to handle moments like this morning. Getting angry solves nothing. Teaching changes everything. A ground crew member approached with clipboard in hand, waiting to get the pilot's signature for the day's flight plan. But even they could sense the importance of this conversation and stood quietly, not wanting to interrupt. The workshop next week, the officer said hesitantly, "I'd really like to come. Not because you suggested it, but because I want to be part of the change." His words carried the weight of genuine commitment, not just obligation. The pilot nodded, a smile finally breaking across his face. Bring your experiences from today. Share them honestly. Sometimes the best lessons come from our mistakes, but only if we're brave enough to acknowledge them and learn from them. The morning had grown warmer, and the pilot still had preparations to complete for his upcoming flight. But this interruption, this moment of connection and understanding, felt more important than any schedule. It represented the kind of change that couldn't be taught in training sessions or written in manuals. Later that afternoon, the airport's administrative offices buzzed with activity. The morning's incident had reached the airport director's desk, and an emergency meeting was called. The large conference room filled quickly with department heads, security supervisors, and human resources personnel. The airport director, a tall woman with 3 decades of aviation experience, stood at the head of the table. The video recordings from that morning played on the large screen behind her, showing how a routine inspection had turned into a teachable moment for the entire airport community. What we witnessed today, she began, her voice firm but thoughtful, was both a failure and an opportunity. A failure in our training, but an opportunity to do better. She paused, letting her words sink in. The room was unusually quiet, everyone feeling the weight of the situation. The head of security shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We've already begun revising our training protocols," he offered. "But I think we need more than just new procedures. We need a complete culture change." His admission surprised many. It wasn't often that department heads so openly acknowledged their areas needed major improvements. Through the conference room's windows, they could see planes taking off and landing, a constant reminder of the dynamic community they served. On one of those runways, the pilot's charter company aircraft was preparing for its afternoon flight, continuing its business despite the morning's events. I spoke with the pilot after the incident, the operations manager added. He's offered to help develop new training materials based on real experiences. He thinks his story, and others like it, could help prevent similar situations in the future. The suggestion was met with nodding heads around the table. Someone from Human Resources raised their hand. "We've already received calls from other airports asking about this incident. Word travels fast in aviation circles. They want to know how we're handling it, what changes we're making." The room buzzed with quiet conversations. Their response would set a precedent. The airport director tapped her pen thoughtfully on the table. "Then let's set the right example. I want a complete overhaul of our security training program. Not just procedures, but implicit bias training, cultural awareness, proper communication protocols." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. A younger staff member spoke up from the back of the room. "The pilot's workshop next week. Maybe we could expand it? Make it part of a larger initiative." The suggestion sparked interest. What started as a small educational event could become something bigger, more impactful. The security supervisor who had been on duty during the incident finally spoke. My officer made a mistake, yes, but the pilot showed us all a better way forward. Instead of filing complaints or demanding punishment, he chose to educate. We need to honor that choice with real action. Papers rustled as the airport director distributed draft proposals for immediate changes. Emergency refresher training for all security personnel would begin tomorrow. New guidance protocols would be implemented by the end of the week. The incident would become a case study in their training materials. One more thing, the director added, standing again. I want everyone to understand something. Changes like this don't just affect our procedures. They affect people's lives, their dignity, their right to do their jobs without facing unnecessary obstacles. We're not just changing rules, we're changing mindsets. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the windows of passing aircraft, creating brief flashes of light in the conference room. Each flash seemed to emphasize the director's words, reminding everyone that transparency and clarity were the best tools for creating lasting change. 1 month had passed since the incident, and the airport felt different. The pilot stood at the front of a packed conference room, sharing his story with a new group of aviation students and security trainees. The young security officer who had confronted him that morning sat in the front row, now helping to teach others about the importance of looking past assumptions. The workshop had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a small career guidance session had transformed into a regular training program. Airlines sent their staff to attend, other airports requested similar programs, and industry publications wanted to cover the story. Success in aviation isn't about what you look like, the pilot explained, gesturing to the diverse group before him. It's about skill, dedication, and perseverance. The room was filled with young faces, each one representing a potential future in aviation. Some took notes, others nodded in understanding, but all were fully engaged. The security officer stood up to share his perspective. His voice, once uncertain, now carried confidence and purpose. A month ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career. Instead, it taught me the most valuable lesson I've ever learned. The students leaned forward, drawn in by his honesty. Through the conference room windows, they could see the pilot's charter company continuing to thrive. His fleet had grown to 4 aircraft now, with plans for expansion. The incident, rather than harming his business, had brought attention to his success story and inspired others in the industry. Change doesn't happen overnight, the pilot continued, walking among the attendees. But it happens every time someone chooses to learn instead of judge, to listen instead of assume. He paused near a young student who reminded him of himself years ago, dreaming of flying but facing countless barriers. The airport's new training protocols had already shown positive results. Security staff reported feeling more confident in their interactions, focusing on actual suspicious behavior rather than personal biases. The atmosphere throughout the airport has shifted, more professional, more inclusive, more aware. Other business owners from the airport community often stopped by these sessions to share their experiences. Today, a maintenance company owner sat in the back, waiting to talk about how diversity had strengthened her team. The workshop had become a platform for many voices, each adding depth to the conversation. But the most important change, the pilot said, pointing to his company's latest aircraft visible through the window, isn't in policies or procedures. It's in people's minds and hearts. The security officer nodded in agreement, remembering his own transformation from that challenging morning. The students asked questions eagerly, not just about aviation careers, but about overcoming obstacles and staying professional in difficult situations. Each answer added another layer to the lesson that had started with a confrontation, but had grown into something much more meaningful. As the session wound down, the pilot and the security officer stood together, a living example of how conflict could lead to connection. Their story had become part of the airport's culture, a reminder that progress often comes from unexpected places and challenging moments. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, planes continued taking off and landing, carrying people to their destinations. But in this room, something even more important was taking flight: understanding, growth, and the promise of positive change in an industry that touched countless lives.